Welcome to First in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write great fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of the Hand of Adonai series, The Bargain, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Alton Gansky, coming to you live and direct from foggy, cold Fresno in Central California. And I'm the author of 40-something books, most recently 30 Events That Shaped the Church, a nonfiction book.
Which I see conveniently placed behind you, some product advertisement there, right behind you.
Well, hang on just a second here. If I could do this without pulling my mic off.
Now that's a fancy book there. I can't see it. Does it look something like this, Pops?
It looks very similar to that. Yes.
Okay. So this is Mercy's Reign. And it's by one Cindy K. Sproles, who I hear is just a fantastic writer and human being. You know what we should have done, Pops, is we should have booked her on the show. That's what we did. Oh, we did. We went ahead and booked her on the show in a very formal manner, with me sending an email this morning and saying, hey, by the way, what are you doing tonight? We're pretty formal here at First in Fictions, but she was available, and so I got this copy in the mail. This is Mercy's Reign. Again, it's an Appalachian novel. I don't know if I said that right. It's by Cindy K. Sproles. Good friend, fellow writer. We've actually co-written a book together. She's been on the podcast before. So Cindy, if I haven't already taken all your wonderful information, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit, and maybe just tell us a little bit about this book that just released.
Well, hi. Thanks for having me. I appreciate you having me on. And you did say it right. You said Appalachian.
Yeah.
And you know, that is really what it is, the Appalachian Mountains. Most of you people say the Appalachians. So
I watch Saturday Night Live, and they talk about Appalachian ER, so I thought maybe that's how you say it.
That's right. That is how you say it. I'm excited. Mercy's Reign is an Appalachian novel. It's set in the late 1800s, and it's about Mercy Roller and her trip through life to make her path of redemption. She is an abused child by her circuit-riding pastor father. So I'm already getting picked on because I picked on the pastors.
It's always the preachers who get blamed.
But it was a good. I think it worked out good. I couldn't sleep one night. It was one of those things where I'm the world's worst to get the book title long before I ever have the story, and I had the book title, and I couldn't come up with anything for it. I woke up in the middle of the night and couldn't sleep, so I flipped on the television, and there was this. Here in the Appalachian Mountains, we do still have those preachers who, you know, are stomping and carrying on, and so that was what you saw at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I thought, boy, that'd be a good antagonist. And then I flipped the television again. To this day, I still don't know what the documentary title was that came on, because it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and you know, and it was the middle of the show. But it was a show about sexual abuse on children under the age of 7, and it just tore my heart out. And I thought, well, there is kind of like the perfect storm coming together, and that's how the story came about. So this is the story of Mercy Roller and how she manages through her life with all of the baggage that she has. And it's her story of redemption.
You know, I like that you mentioned that it was a kind of a culmination of a couple different ideas coming together, a little bit of serendipity, but also you had the foresight to put those two things together, and that's just fantastic. And like you say, it's got some darkness. This is kind of a dark book. I had the privilege of actually reading it. This is me who forgot to unplug his phone before the podcast. My phone never rings, so now it's ringing. But it's got some darkness to it, but what I like about it is the redemption in it shines that much brighter coming from that darkness. If you don't mind, I don't think I've ever done this before. Can I just read your first line? Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. I didn't know if it was copyright or if I was going to get in trouble with your publisher there.
Okay.
But the first couple lines here says, married and widowed at 13, a mother and childless at 15, Ain't nobody should have to learn life like I did. No soul should have to claw their way back from the bowels of hell, sacred and scraped up, or I'm sorry, scarred and scraped up like I was. So, I mean, what a fantastic opening, a few opening lines there, and that kind of sets the tone for the remainder of the novel. I just wrote an Amazon review of it. I said it was very much reminiscent of the Poisonwood Bible meets Flannery O'Connor, that kind of stuff. Yeah, I know. I'm sending you some high praise, Cindy. Sending you some high praise. So
It's a dark story. In the beginning, it is a very dark story, and though it is a climb to her redemption, and it slowly gets better and better, it just keeps piling the angst on, you know. So right when you think that she's worked her way through it, something else happens. But it doesn't tie up in a nice, neat little bow at the end either. It ends good, but it doesn't end like you expect it to end.
There's some spoiler alerts right there.
Yeah.
I will say the aliens coming down and abducting her, that was kind of out of left field, but you know, I trust that you have a plan.
Yeah, I have a plan.
Yeah, that didn't actually happen, by the way. That's not how it ends. But yeah, it's a really fantastic book. It's a great read. It's available, I think, currently on Amazon and all the other common outlets. Is that correct?
It is, and it's actually in stores. They're slowly putting it on the shelves in stores. So I have people who are sending me notes and saying, I finally got it. So it's the first one. You know, that's your baby. That's the one you've waited for. So I'm excited.
Sure, absolutely.
I do have a feel like a little girl.
Yeah, it's exciting. I do have a connection at my local Barnes and Noble here in Southern California at Victorville, the big, huge city of Victorville. So if you ever want to fly all the way out to Victorville to sign some books, let me know. I'll set something up for you. So
that'd be great. So we'll do that.
Excellent. Well, let's go ahead and get rolling today on Self-Made Rules. But before we do so, as is our custom for the last couple of weeks, we got our publishing term for the week. You got that for us, Pops?
I do. Last week, well, first week we talked about over the transom, that is submitting without permission, throwing it over the door through the little window above the old doors. The second one we talked about was letting, the space between lines. Today we talked about single space, double space, and so on. They used to use strips of lead when they set the type by hand, but the term is stuck, so if you hear somebody talk about the leading in a book, that's what they're talking about, the spacing of the lines. And now similar to that is a thing called kerning, 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 and kerning is the space between letters in a word. So sometimes when they need to make your book look bigger, they'll increase the leading and they'll increase the kerning. If they need to get it all squished down into a smaller book, well, then they'll decrease the kerning and decrease the leading. That's what you get with a small paperback, mass market paperback. So our publishing term for the day is kerning, last week leading, and the week before that over the transom.
So the kerning is really used to maximize words on page to make it, I'm imagining, cheaper for the publisher. Is that correct?
Well, usually they want to have less pages. We'll give you a second term, and it's called signature. That's a certain number of pages on a large piece of paper, which is later cut and bound into the book. Get into that more detail some other time when we talk about signature. Ideally, they want fewer pages, but publishers have to work in this weird balance. They have to make sure the reader feels they're getting a value for the money. So if you're going to go out and buy, say, a hardbound book and you're going to plunk down $25 or $30 or something for it, like a Stephen King novel, then usually you want it. They want a thicker book. So they feel like they're getting value. A book too thin is seen as throwaway. So there's a balance between that. How do we get the right size book, get it at the right cost to us so we can get a decent profit off of it, and still make the readers feel like they got a good deal for their money. So they will adjust line spacing, they'll adjust word spacing, they'll adjust where the chapter begins. And even the tradition is that you always start a chapter on it. If you look at the book on the right-hand page, we'll give you a term for that at another time, but on the right-hand page, I've seen books where they've broken that tradition and put it on the back of the left-hand page to save a few pages. So it varies from book to book.
Very interesting. Very interesting indeed. All right. Well, excellent. Today we're talking about uh, self-made rules, and this is kind of something that I'd been playing with the idea of this for a while. Really inspired by a poem I read by Marianne Moore called "The Fish." And actually, any of her poems, most of her poems at least, if you look them up and really kind of take some time to study them, what you find is that she's writing in a very structured form, but it's not a form that is commonly used. As a matter of fact, to my knowledge, and my limited poetic knowledge here, I don't know that anybody else has written in these forms um, other than her. And if you look at them, they're varied from poem to poem, but a lot of times you'll see some commonalities. You'll see the first line in a stanza is one syllable followed by a three-syllable line, followed by a 15-syllable line, and then there will be like eight, I don't know, or maybe four or five 10-syllable lines. But it's consistent from stanza to stanza. And the rhyme scheme that she uses is not always A B A B or A B B A, but she's got a consistent rhyme scheme that is identical from stanza to stanza. And the more I looked at it, the more I was pretty much just amazed that anybody could come up with something like this, number one, and number two, write it in such a way that it's not calling attention to itself, that it's not distracting, and that she can maintain that form for stanza after stanza after stanza. And it boggled my mind. So I had this idea that we as writers, oftentimes, especially with our prose, we have our own rules that we follow. We make up our own rules. Now there are some rules that are given to us from other sources that come to us from different places, be it the internet or common writing rules. And then there are those that we make for ourselves, and we say, in this project, I want to do this particular thing. And maybe it's the same from project to project, but a lot of times it's not. So I thought we might just kind of talk a little bit about that tonight. Would you guys, in your experience, do you guys kind of have some of your own rules that you follow too? Would you say that I'm accurate on that, or am I just kind of off in left field?
Let's tell him he's off in left field, Cindy, and see what he does.
You're off in left field, Aaron.
Okay, then that concludes our podcast for tonight. Thank you all for tuning in.
Well,
go ahead, Cindy.
I can tell you, for me, with this book with Mercy's Reign, I got to break a lot of rules because of the voice of the story. It's written in that mountain story, and so I really did get to break a lot of rules that normally you don't get by with at all. And I wondered if that would happen when it went into the editing process with the editors, but it flew. It made it, so I did get to break a lot of rules.
Now, when you say that, you mean rules by the publisher or sort of the standard of the industry? Not your rules, but rules of someone else?
Rules of someone else, yes.
Right.
Those basic fiction rules a lot of times, that we are supposed to follow, that they say until you're a really well-published writer you can't get away with. But because of this book, and I think the voice of this book, I was able to do a lot of things that most people aren't able to do in a regular book and get away with it.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point. I did a blog post on Edie Melson's blog, and I pulled from something I had written quite a while ago, and it had to do with Arthur C. Clarke. One of my favorite books is Rendezvous with Rama, science fiction. Here's the thing about Arthur C. Clarke is he starts off slow. We always teach you have to start off with some action, maybe in the middle of an action or middle of a scene. He starts off slow. You don't want to have too much narration up front because you'll lose the reader. He's almost all narration. I counted the pages. There's a number of pages before you see the first line of dialogue, and the dialogue lasts for 2 pages, and there's like another 15 pages of narration that goes on. So in short, he just did it his way, and we would say he broke all the rules, and yet somehow he remained a great writer, wrote fabulous stuff, and really didn't care a great deal about most of the rules we have to labor under. He just wrote the good stuff, and it sold. So sometimes that's what you have to do, because there are rules that are put upon us from the industry, the publisher, sometimes our own genre, because romance is different than Amish, and Amish is different than cozy mystery, and cozy mystery is different than suspense, and so on. And there's certain things we look for in that are almost rules. Give us an example of what rule you broke.
Well, I have quite a bit of narration too, so I did break that rule. I have dialogue in there too. I tried to space it out, but since it is written first person, it does have quite a bit of narration in it, and that was one of the things I worried about. Would all of that go by? Would they get it past the editors? And it did. It got past the editors. I thought that they would make me add more dialogue than what I did in places. So that was one of the things that I got to break.
I do want to jump in here and make a couple points. We've said this before on the podcast several times, and at some point I might be beating a dead horse, and my apologies if I am, but rules are there for a reason, and they're definitely good guidelines. So when the industry and publishers and editors and genre readers and all these people are giving us these quote-unquote rules, they're rules because they generally work. That being said, you can't. There's no way to follow all of the rules that everybody has ever written down, because if so, you just wouldn't write anything. What's really interesting to me about the Marianne Moore poems specifically are that she breaks several rules, and yet she's established her own. And so while you may have broken some quote-unquote industry rules, your writing is strong enough, clearly, to kind of cover that, to show that you have the ability to break the rules in a precise way, right? When you break the rules, you want to do it for a reason. You want to have that a particular impact on the reader. And once you know the rules, then you can break them, purposefully and with intent to have that desired impact. So this is not to say that if you're a beginning writer, just start breaking rules because it's going to make you cool. It won't. First, before Marianne Moore wrote these incredibly complicated poems, she wrote sonnets, she wrote villanelles, she wrote rondos, she wrote, you name the form, she's probably got 100 of them sitting in her notebooks at home. But it was through that practice and following those rules that she discovered the rules that worked for her and the rules that she perhaps may bend, and perhaps some rules that she just might outright break, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah, it does to me, and I think the takeaway point here is, if you're going to break a rule, have a good reason to do it. Don't do it just willy-nilly. Sometimes something in the story will require that you do things a little different. And I think of a Dean Koontz story in which there's a young girl, but she talks like an adult. And I'm a third of the way through the book, and I'm thinking, this is just not, I started to say age appropriate. Well, yeah, the speech wasn't age appropriate. I kept thinking this kid would not talk that way. And you get it in Odd Thomas. You've read Odd Thomas, I know, Aaron. Yeah. Several of those books, and this just does not sound like a short order cook talking. Mm-hmm. But when you read on, you find out there's a reason for it. And that's what I discovered in this. What he was really doing was giving us a clue. So it looked like he was bending the rules. He wasn't. He was setting things up.
And when you're Dean Koontz, you can get away with that, right? I noticed the same thing with Odd Thomas. I was like, at some point he was talking about the bowling alley, and he gave us the entire, history of bowling from the Stone Age on, and I thought, he's a short order cook? This is what he does? And yet he knows this much about bowling, and I researched. I'm like, oh, well, you're researching bowling? That just seems kind of weird. So, but yeah, I mean, it's consistent with this character. He's a quirky character. He likes to know some of these things. So it does seem at outset that it's a rule that he's breaking, but again, maybe it's a little bit more of a bending for sure.
Yeah, and I've had experiences like that too, where we've had to break it. I did a scene that took place where there was no human observer. And since I write in a close third-person point of view most of the time, or first person, but when I'm in third person, it's usually quite close. I needed someone down there. What was at the bottom of the ocean? So I thought about pulling a Stephen King and doing a point of view from maybe a Dungeness crab or something, but that didn't seem like it was going to work for me. So finally, I just stepped out of the close point of view, and I went to the omniscient point of view, and just had a narrator tell us what was going on, and it worked. I don't think I could have done it through the whole book, but that circumstance required something a little different. The rest of the book, I tried to stay within my personal guidelines and then the guidelines I know that the publisher wants. Now, Molly's reminding us the rules are made to be broken, and then she says yes. Only if there's a good reason.
Yeah. I think Quotidian Light just said that same thing. You have to know the rules before you can break them. Yeah, and I feel like we've kind of, we've said that. So we've talked a little bit about rules that we've broken. I guess I didn't, but that's because I never break any of the rules. I'm a good boy. I never do anything wrong. Pops, you can attest to that. I've never done anything bad in my life. Let's talk about some of these rules.
Shaking my head.
Thanks for saying that audibly so the podcast listeners can
shaking
share in the
my
joke
head.
there. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the rules that we establish for ourselves. And Pops, you were mentioning before the show that we can kind of break these into two different categories. One category would be the discipline of creative writing, and perhaps how many words we write in a day, and so on. And then also rules that we set for ourselves in terms of our craft and really honing our skills and what we want to do, is prosaically speaking, if you will, in order to accomplish or to achieve the effect that we're looking for. So let's just kind of start real quick with the discipline. What kind of rules do you set for yourself as a writer in context of the discipline of getting the job actually done? Pops, let's start with you.
Well, I have several. Usually what I'll do is I say I have to write a certain number of words per day. Words is the best way to do the counting of your progress. You can use pages if you want, but if you're using a larger font, if you're using greater leading, and maybe a very spacious kerning, then you're not going to get the same kind of word count. Generally, you're going to get about 300 words per page. It'll be less if it's a lot of dialogue. It'll be more if it's a lot of narration. So I quit using number of pages. I use number of words, unless I'm timing myself, and then I want to do 3 pages an hour or something, so a page every 20 minutes. But I know that's going to convert into the word count. And I think that's important for new writers, is that you write every day that you can, at least 5 days a week, even if it's a small amount. If all you can get down is 100 words, over time that will add up. But to be consistent in that. So I always set a word goal when I'm on a project. The second thing I do is I want to make sure that I'm increasing my knowledge. So I keep track of who's writing what, especially if it's in my genre, and I will study them as my mentor. I used Dean Koontz early on as my mentor because of the way he could describe scenes, the way he used language, how tight the writing was, that sort of thing. So I made him my mentor. I've never met him. I don't have to talk to him for him to be my mentor. I have his work on my shelf, so I can study that at my leisure and at any time of day. And then I made a goal to always make my next work better than my last one. The way to get around that, of course, is to write something really bad, so your next one will be a lot easier to be better than. But after a while, it becomes quite a challenge is to be better with each project. And hopefully you're better at the end of your book than you were at the beginning of your book.
I'm going to jump in here real quick before I get to Cindy. That's an interesting dynamic that you talked about, and of course you're joking when you say start with a bad book. But I used to really follow the music scene, and I'd get these great first albums from these bands that I just really love, and then I'd hear their second album, and I'd be like, what happened? What happened to you? And I have to remind myself, they've had decades to write their first album. They've had months to write their second. And so the amount of time that they're able to pour into their craft and invest in their craft, sometimes you don't see a real solid progression, but generally by the third or fourth album, you're starting to see a lot of really quality work coming out, and people doing more experimentation within their art form. I think novelists are oftentimes the same way. Not to say that every author's second book is their worst, but when you look at an author, what they've done with their first book, it's been their baby, they've worked on it for years and years, and then their second book that they wrote on deadline, it seems a little more rushed sometimes, and then they seem to find their stride usually around the third or fourth. You can't say that for all authors, but you can say it for some. It's just an interesting point that you brought up. Cindy, in terms of discipline, how do you keep yourself disciplined as a writer? What steps do you take? What rules do you make for yourself to ensure that you're putting words on page?
I try to write every single day, and like Al, I try to write a word count. I set a goal for myself of 3,000 words a day. Now, I can't. I have to be honest and say I don't always get that many, but most of the time I do. Most of the time I get that much out of it, especially when I'm working on a project, when I'm in the middle of writing a book. That's the big goal I set for it. And the other thing for me is because my voice is strong within the mountains, that's just where my gift lies. I keep myself up to date on the lingo of this area, on the culture of this area. Because I want to be able to dig down into the emotion of these people in this culture that I write in. So I do a lot of research online. I love the Foxfire books. I even have family in the Foxfire books that I can go dig down in and make sure that the research that I do is accurate. So I spend a lot of time, kind of putting myself down into the culture of that too. So setting a goal for myself to write every day, and then burying myself down in the culture of what I write so that the voice stays true.
Absolutely.
And I think it's important for people to understand that when they're researching, like what you're talking about, that is writing. So sometimes if you're in the deep research portion of your book, you may not be getting a lot of words down on the page, but that is writing. That's what's going to allow you to write more pages faster later. So that is part of the writing process. That is part of the production. So don't penalize yourself if you're doing heavy research, you're doing a lot of digging, and you say, I didn't even get 100 words written today. That's just part of it, and that is part of the writing. Sitting and looking out the window sometimes is part of the writing process, letting things germinate.
I've had to remind myself of that. I've got my very lofty goal of 1,000 words per day, and now Cindy makes me feel completely inadequate. So thank you for that. But I set up a goal, 1,000 words a day, and more often than not, I don't hit that. And when I say don't hit that, what I mean is I don't write 1,000 words on my current project every day. I wish I did. In my mind, that's what it is. I want to write 1,000 words a day, and I do. I usually end up writing 2,000 or 3,000 words. It's just not on the project that I want to write. It's for something else. It's a blog post for this, or an article for that, or a review of this. And so there are so many auxiliary things going on. I have to remind myself, marketing time counts as writing for me. I have to train my brain to think that way. Otherwise, I would never ever market. And then I would start hiring people to do my marketing for me, which I'm actually probably going to end up doing because I'm terrible at it. But back to the point that I was making. I do write, but it's not always on my current project. So I've recently revised that aspect of my rules in terms of discipline to say that I'm going to write something on my project every day. I'm going to be in my current project every day. Even if I only get 5 words one day, I know some other day I'm going to get 2,000 or 3,000. But as long as I'm in that project and I'm maintaining that story world in my mind, today I spent very little time in my current project. I was able to review 1 or 2 scenes, but driving home I had a complete breakthrough, and it's like now I know exactly where I'm going, and I can't wait to get back to work tomorrow because I know that time that I've missed leading up to it is I'm going to start making that up starting tomorrow, and I'm excited because I had that breakthrough, and it came from spending 5 or 10 minutes in my project every day. So you have to be aware of your responsibilities to your jobs and your families and everything else, but you cannot Yeah, I don't think you can compromise writing time. You've got to prioritize that. I think that's consistent between the three of us. We all have other things going on, but we prioritize the writing.
Well, I'm one of those. I'm like when I go to a conference, I'm one of those little wind-up robots that, you wind me up and I go in and I sit down and I write everything down. I bring it home and I do what you've told me to do on the sheet of paper. So I'm a good little student. And so for me, that was one of the things that I've always heard at conferences. You need to at least try to write, 1,800, 2,000, 3,000 words a day if you can. And so I just kind of groomed myself up into doing that, and I didn't give myself permission. So Al, thank you. It's nice to know that that my research counts as writing. I can give myself a break now. Thank you.
Well, it's a mistake that a lot of people make. They think, well, writing is putting words on the page, and ultimately it is. But to have good stuff to put on the page, you have to do the research.
Right.
You have to do the reading, and sometimes it's to break away and read somebody who's done something, not the same story, but at least in the same genre. What am I missing? When I first started writing, I would sit down with books that were close to mine, and I would analyze the number of chapters, number of pages in the chapter. Is it first person? Is it third person? And I would analyze each of these books. So when I had that in my mind, then I could start. Well, that was all writing too. I didn't get words on a page, but when I started putting words on the page, they mattered. They were solid and they were usable, as opposed to me just flailing at the keyboard.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, I hear that. I'm really curious. This was kind of the meat for me. I want to talk craft. I love craft. You guys know me. I can't get enough of it. I'm curious what rules do you make for your craft? And then a couple other questions I'm just going to throw out there now that we can kind of tackle as they come up. But some of the questions that we wanted to talk about tonight. What rules do you have that you make for yourself? And do they vary from project to project? Do you say, on this project I want to use these rules and I'm not going to pay as much attention to that rule? Or are you pretty consistent with your self-made rules from project to project? And then here's one that I've been dealing with myself. I make a lot of rules for myself, and sometimes I make some pretty ridiculous rules for myself, and I end up, I think, handcuffing myself more than helping. These rules that I'm so militant about end up becoming more handcuffs than helpers, and I end up writing these really obscure sentences that nobody can understand because I'm trying to avoid a particular word. So what is it that I'm just curious, what kind of rules do you guys have, and have you had any similar experiences where these rules have actually kind of backfired on you?
Well, I want to jump in on something you said there, Aaron. Because I think we've all made this mistake, and people make it all the time, and that is they think that they're doing their best writing if they're checking things off a list. I did my minimum number of words per day, and I went back and I edited whatever it was I wrote yesterday. I did all these checklists, and they sometimes lose the whole purpose of the story or what you're writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. They lose the heart of the matter. And what really matters is getting a good story, getting it done, and getting it done right, not checking stuff off a list. The checklist is merely there to keep you from going astray. It's just a simple reminder. When I sit down to work, like here it is today, you're not going to be able to read all that, but I write at the top, and I do it by hand. I don't do it in a computer. My computers are all tied together. If I put it in the computer, I'd have it wherever I went on my phone and stuff, but I don't do that. You'd think it's a to-do list, but I've changed recently, and I write at the top, today I will, and then I put an ellipse, and I start listing things. And what I found out is when I look at the list, I'm looking at things to accomplish, not things to check off a list. It's things I want to see get done, and that's made a difference. So we're talking about rules. It's good to have guidelines, things to keep you on track, but remember what matters is your project. It's getting your story done and getting it done well. And if that means you have to take a break, if that means you're writing more than you're writing now, less than you're writing now, it's the project that matters. That's what should be at the heart of all your thinking is, will this help get it done?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So then, with that in mind, what guidelines are? I'm curious. You've got the today I will kind of ellipses. What types of things do you put on there in context of craft? Do you have anything on there in context of craft?
Uh, no, not recently because I'm working on the writers' conference and I'm working on promotion for the new book and stuff like that. All the stuff you have to do when you'd really rather be writing and researching, but it's the other stuff that goes with it. My mental list, which stays with me all the time, is I will write tight prose.
Mm-hmm.
I will write tight prose. I will evict clutter. It took me a long time to learn this. If you read my first book by my hands, which you can, I've reissued, and you compare it to, say, Wounds, my last novel, you see it's very different. Well, I had to learn. I had to fall and skin my knees and stuff like that. It's not that the first one is bad. It's just not as tight as it could be. It still tells a good story. Readers aren't going to notice. Writers will notice the difference. And so I try to get rid of every bit of clutter. Double prepositions, try to get rid of those. I can't remember if we talked in the show about pleonasms and tautologies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, pleonasms using too many words. It means plenty of words. She blinked her eyes. What else would she blink? It's kind of silly, some of them, but they do sneak in. And no matter how hard you try, they will sneak in. So don't get overly discouraged. I'm grinning here because I was at a writers' conference in Kansas City teaching, and I was reading the first page of one of my books, and I just taught them this. You don't put these kind of pleonasms and tautologies in here. Tautology is a repetition, a free gift. If it's a gift, it's free. But I was teaching about the pleonasms. You don't say she blinked her eyes. And so I read the first page of this new book. Last line, first page. She held a towel in her hand as opposed to holding it in her teeth. I don't know. But it got by me. Very first page.
If she's a monkey, she might be holding it with her feet. So I think that's important information.
Yeah.
You were giving us a hint that she's actually a monkey. Am I right? That's not what it was?
No, that wasn't it at all. No.
Okay.
Yes, so. But anyway, the point is, no one does things perfectly. This kind of stuff. But this is, in my mind, I try to write tight, evict the clutter. I purpose never to forget the reader. The tendency is to say, I'm going to write this and be great, or it's going to be loved, I'm going to win awards. Yeah, forget all that. You write for the reader. Never lose sight of your reader. If you do that, then you might be loved, and it might be great, and it might sell well. But you always keep in mind the reader. And I remind myself, I have a vision of somebody reading the book when I'm working on it. I have another one. I will not argue with people who buy ink by the barrel. That comes from Ben Bova. He used to write. It's now Dr. Ben Bova, old-time science fiction writer. Did some good stuff. When I first thought I'd write short stories, and I sent him something, and it was rejected, and it came back with their standardized mimeographed, of all things, form. And it said, "Thou shalt not argue with he who buys ink by the barrel." And so often we as writers and teachers of writing will encounter somebody who wants to argue with us, even though we've got the experience and stuff, and seldom are they right. And so I had to learn that early on. That, the editors are there for the benefit of the product, the reader, and for me. That took me a while to learn. And then just the last one I'll give you is I will learn from my mistakes.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's powerful. I mean, it's short and simple. I will learn from my mistakes, but there is power in that. There's a lot of power in that because you have to recognize your mistakes, right? Which means you need to be studying the craft so that you can realize, oh, this is something that I shouldn't be doing. So I don't end up saying she held the towel in her hands. These are things that we can find in our writing all over the place. But when we learn that, okay, I made a mistake. Let's move on. I will learn from it. That's a great one. I also fight viciously to evict clutter. If you are a longtime listener, you will possibly remember our podcast from last year called Sneaky Prose Killers. It's one of my more referenced articles that I put together actually came from my old agent, I believe, Cindy, your current agent, Diana Flegel, who sent me a list of things. She said, hey, you should probably not use these words. And she said you probably should not use these words. I went through and eliminated all of them, and my prose immediately became better. And thanks to that. So that's something that I subscribe to, is a particular list that I have, and that's something that goes with me from project to project. Regardless of what I'm doing, I will always double check with that list and make sure that I'm not falling into some common traps of making passive characters and things of that nature. So I do that. It helps me to evict the clutter, as you say, Pops. It helps me keep my writing tight. I would add one, and this may actually cause a bit of a controversy, as Jimmy Fallon would say. I aspire to never tell my readers what to think, though I will dictate what they feel. And I think there's a fine line there. If I am telling my readers what to think in my fiction, I might as well write nonfiction. At that point, I've got a soapbox, I've got a point I want to make, and that's what nonfiction exists for. So the point of my fiction is never to tell people what to think. It's to ask them questions. It's for them to examine what they think. But I will dictate how they feel, and I think there's a difference between what they think and what they feel. So as writers, I think we have to be keenly aware of our readers, as you said, Pops, what they're feeling, how they're going to react to particular situations. But I also say, from project to project, my point is not to dictate how my readers are going to think, but instead I want to dictate what they're going to feel. So those are a couple that follow me from project to project. Cindy, how about you? Are there some overarching kind of self-made rules that you follow?
Well, you just said what I had jotted down to say, and that is, for me, I try to make myself as much a part of that character in my head as I can make them. I want to dig down into the emotion of that person and get to know them. So I'm like you in that respect, and that I want my readers to feel what their character is feeling, because there's been so many things that I've read that it's almost like the writer is, or the main character is kind of standing over here, and they're not as involved as I feel like they ought to be. And so I want my readers to be involved. I want them to understand the pain and the hurt. So I once had a very good friend that said, try to think of it like this. You have a scab on your hand, and so you just keep scratching it, and you scratch it until it bleeds. And when you scratch it that hard and it starts to bleed, then you're going to be putting the words on the page that grab with the emotion that the reader needs to really become involved in your story. And then you've got them. It's almost as good as the hook. You've got them then, because you've got them emotionally attached.
Absolutely, and that emotion is, I think, my another rule that I follow pretty strictly is avoiding purple prose, avoiding melodrama. I am very militant about that. Like I will kill every exclamation point I come across in my writing. I just do my best to avoid that melodrama. But this kind of leads us, I think, a little bit to our one of the questions is do your rules ever become a hindrance to you? They do to me sometimes, because in my quest, my very noble quest to avoid melodrama and cliche, sometimes I end up going too far and trying to make things too eloquent, and it ends up just losing it. Or I'm so subtle that the reader completely misses what it is I'm trying to impart. I've actually had editors say things like that, like, why is this going on? And it's, oh, well, don't you remember from 48 pages ago I gave you 3 words that told you, and oh yeah, that was 48 pages ago and I completely forgot. So one of my rules here of never repeating myself actually becomes more of a hindrance, because at some point the reader does need a gentle reminder, and so I feel like that sometimes has kind of cost my writing and made it a little sloppier when it doesn't need to be that sloppier, perhaps. In my quest to be so neat and tidy, what is it, the baby with the bathwater? Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. when you're trying to avoid cliches. You don't. Let's
Welcome
see.
to my world.
Yeah. You throw babies out with bathwater?
No, but I throw cliches around.
You know, and in the mouth of a character, it's not necessarily the end of the world in the mouth of a character. But I try not to have the cliches in the mouth of the narrator. Is one thing that one of the rules that I kind of adhere to. So excellent. Other rules that you have for well, let me ask you this: how do you have you guys ever experienced that where some of your rules have kind of backfired on you?
Well, I know in the cutting of the clutter and writing tight can occasionally deprive a scene of power. Sometimes it's good to be a touch redundant, not necessarily using the same word. What's the thing from Cheers? What he's saying? That I'm redundant, that I repeat myself, that I say the same thing over and over again. Of course, illustrating the redundancy in all of that. But there's a rhythm. Sometimes there's a beauty when you add a few extra words. So when you remove the clutter, when you write tight, you do so until it hurts the sentence. And if the sentence begins to fall apart, or it suddenly loses its emotive quality, it loses its power, then you want to back up a step or two. And sometimes it's better just to leave those things. Sometimes extra salt is a good thing in the soup.
Absolutely. You can't have too much salt, but it's also very possible to undersalt. How about you, Cindy? Do you ever find in your writing that in your militant commitment to your self-made rules that you've ended up handcuffing yourself?
Oh yeah, I have. And I think for me the biggest thing for me is more like on the editing end of it. You know, I found myself in the beginning writing a chapter and then rewriting the chapter and rewriting the chapter and rewriting the chapter and never moving on to the next chapter. You know, and so it definitely hurt me because I wasn't making any progress. I was writing those words, but I wasn't getting anywhere with them because as fast as I was writing them, I was throwing them away. So I had to learn from the editing standpoint, you know, I needed to edit and draw the line, you know, and then move ahead. Then you can go back. So I've got myself to a point now where I'll write a chapter, I'll go back and read it and make a few tweaks. I'll write the next chapter and then go back to the beginning and make sure that I have everything that flows good and I can cut out and tighten up that way. But once I get to the halfway point, I stop and go back and really start to look at it to make sure that I don't have any holes or anything. And that does cause a problem every now and then because it brings you to a halt.
See, already my hackles are going off a little bit. I don't know if that's what you say in the Appalachian Mountains, hackles going off, but I've probably just embarrassed myself thoroughly. But the going back to chapter 1 when you're halfway through the novel to me is like red flags, bells and whistles for my personal writing style. I don't rewrite chapter 1 until I've written the end on the book. As a matter of fact, and this is, you know, it's a militant commitment I have. It's a writing rule, self-made writing rule that I have. I don't revise until the end of the book, which is problematic and has been several times. It's handcuffed me, especially in a multi-book series when I've made changes in book 3 or book 4 and I go, yeah, I now have to change about 16 different things across the span of 3 novels. I'm going to have to hunt those down and find them and make some corrections. That's gonna take some time. So there are times where it's like if I stop right then and make the appropriate adjustments, it might save me time. But I'm so terrified that because I've caught myself in that same trap. Write chapter 1, rewrite chapter 1, rewrite chapter 1, rewrite chapter 1, and never get to chapter 2. I've been there, and now I'm terrified of ever becoming a backslider. And so I've the pendulum. I think we've got this pendulum of our commitment to one rule or another, and it's very possible. I know this is going to shock you, but we can be very reactionary as a society, and I think as writers we can be very reactionary, and in our bloodlust for, you know, sticking to our rules, sometimes we end up doing ourselves more harm than good. So, Pops, do you have any more the rules that have backfired on you?
Well, no, nothing backfires on me. Well, my career, but other than that, no, I've not had too many because I'm not real strenuous in making a ton of rules for myself. I have some craft guidelines, but because I'm an intuitive writer, I often don't quite know where I'm going till I get there, and I try to remain true to that act of discovery. And touching on what you were talking about, I think it's Angie Hunt. I just did an interview with her on Writers Talk, which you can see at altongansky.com. Just click on the Writers Talk tab. This program has been brought to you by.
Yeah, really, Pops. Where's my advertising dollars here, huh?
It's in the mail. Anyway, I think she once told me that when she writes, she just starts and barrels through to the end. And when she gets to the end, she has 75% of a book, and what she has is pretty much garbage. But she has the story, and that's all she cared about. Then she goes back and she starts over, working what she has, adding what she forgot. Sometimes she would just write, I need a chapter here about this, and then move on to the next chapter. So she could at least get the story down. Once she had that, for her, then she could go back and focus now on making it a readable story and flushing it out. And so what you bring up is really a good point. You really can't compare yourself to others, or you shouldn't compare yourself to others. The way you write is not going to be the same as the way Cindy writes, or the way that I write, or the way Dean Koontz writes, or anyone else. We just all do it the way our brain is wired, and that is absolutely the right way to do it. There's craft things you have to take care of, and certain things you have to meet, but as far as the manner in which you get there is really your choice. And if you like to write late at night, do that. If you're early in the morning, whenever.
I like that you say that she writes 75%, or when she's done, she's got 75% of a book, and what she has is mostly garbage. And I tend, as an intuitive writer, I look at that and say, no, she's got an outline. That's my outline. It's not a good first draft. I'm going to call it an outline and be happy with my work. And then you go through and you polish it up and you make it beautiful. But for sure, that's one way of handling it. And I like that you're stressing, find what works for you. And that's kind of the point of these self-made rules, right? Read the craft books, study craft. That, I think, is a rule that everyone should follow, and then figure out what works for you. I am not Stephen King. I know that shocks you. I cannot write the way he writes, but he writes some pretty fantastic stuff, and my books are not terrible. So you find what works for you. So absolutely. We are coming up on time here. So Cindy, anything that you would like to contribute, or Pops, before we sign off here?
Oh, I just appreciate you having me on. Thanks for the book plug.
Yeah. Hey, we're all about advertising here. We're all about the shameless
advertising dollars are in the mail.
Okay. For more shameless self-promotion, visit aarongansky.com and get all the self-promotion, shameless self-promotion that you need there. So, excellent. Well, next week, I just looked it up and I'm drawing a blank. What did we have online for next week, Pops? Do you recall off the top of your head?
I'm not done watching you squirm yet.
I appreciate that. Thanks for the assist.
You sent it to me, and I'm
going to use those advertising dollars to find a new co-host. Oh, the gauntlet has been thrown down. I'm going to find it before you. Identifying your audience. There it is. Identifying your audience.
No, don't tell me. Don't tell me. It's identifying your audience.
I already told you. So, identifying your audience. Actually, that's going to be a pretty fantastic topic. If you have questions regarding how to identify your audience or something you'd like us to tackle, please leave us a note on our Facebook page, or you can shoot me an email at aarongansky.com or tweet me at adgansky. Pops, how can they get a hold of you?
Through the website, altongansky.com, and there you'll find First in Fiction. You'll find the Writers Talk podcast also, and then some stuff about the books I'm doing, and we're even going to get a little more active than that on the website. But that's probably the best way. From there, you can bridge to the Writers Conference and other places in the constellation of Al Gansky.
Excellent. And Cindy, thank you so much for joining us. Why don't you? How can readers get in touch with you, and how can they get a copy of this wonderful novel called Mercy's Reign?
Well, they can get in touch with me through the website, through cindysproles.com or through christiandevotions.us, either way. And hopefully that book is in bookstores everywhere, I hope.
Yeah, I hope so too. I'm going to go to my local Barnes & Noble and start snapping some
If
pictures.
it's not there, ask them to put it there.
Oh, I will. I'm going to give them. I'm going to give them heck if it's not there. So.
I never knew if
And
that was a good thing or a bad thing, Aaron. Somebody would take a photo of my books on the bookshelf and send it to me. And my first thought is, oh, that's nice. My second thought is, they've not sold out?
mhm, they're not selling.
Yeah.
As a matter of
So,
fact, I think I'm going to also take pictures of your books on the shelves and just send you a little text that says, "Guess what's not selling? Ha ha." So that's why my book is not in stores, so that I don't get those texts. So, well, awesome. Thank you all for joining us. Appreciate you. Those of you watching live, been awesome. Appreciate that. And until next week, good writing.